for 1.1, we're looking at business activities. And business activity refers to the process of producing goods and services in order to satisfy consumer demands. In order to know this topic much better, we need to know what are needs and wants. Needs refers to goods and services which are essential for our survival, whereas wants are purely things that we want to have, are nice to have, but are not really essential for our survival. The key difference here is that needs can probably be satisfied, whereas wants primarily are never-ending and cannot be satisfied. So the basic economic problem that businesses try to solve is how do we allocate our scarce resources in order to satisfy unlimited needs and wants. So scarcity refers to resources which are in limited supply, but we need to find a way to allocate them in order to create goods and services to satisfy needs and wants. So the next thing that we need to understand is what are opportunity costs. So opportunity cost refers to the next best alternative which we give up if we choose to do something. So a simple application of this would be, you could choose to either watch this video to the end, or you could stop it halfway and then go and do something else completely. You can't do both of them at once. One of them has to be given up when you choose to do the other. So choose wisely, keep watching. So one of the key reasons why we need to deal with the problem of scarcity is because there's never really enough factors of production in order to produce goods and services to satisfy those needs and wants. And when we talk about factors of production, we are referring to four main things, which would be land, natural resources that you find in nature, such as oil, timber, water. We have labor, which will refer to employees that work in jobs, the hours that they spend working. Next thing that we have would be capital, which refers to machinery, equipment, or even money that you use to start businesses. Like in this case, capital will refer to the video camera that I'm using to film this video. And lastly, we have enterprise. Enterprise refers to the skills and risk-taking that a person brings together in order to create a business. So enterprise would pretty much refer to the people we call entrepreneurs. The next concept that we need to understand is specialization, where people or businesses concentrate on what they are best at. This enables businesses to make use of the limited resources that they have in the best way possible. So one way that we accomplish this is through the division of labor, where production processes are split into different tasks and people, or rather workers, concentrate on the parts that they are best at. One very easy way of seeing this would be how cars are produced. So they will have individual workers to work on each separate part in order to create a car. So perhaps one person works on the body of the car, another person works on the engine of a car, and lastly, I could be working on the wheels. Now, the usage of specialization has intensified over the years as a result of different reasons. First of all, specialization is also more commonplace because specialized machinery and technology is much more widely available. Secondly, increased competition has also led businesses to have to focus on specialization in order to keep costs lower. Lastly, higher living standards can also be obtained through specialization. So why would companies want to focus on specialization? So there are some main advantages. First of all, as workers continue to specialize in the tasks that they're given, they tend to increase their efficiency, and that leads to higher outputs for the business. And not to mention that time is going to be saved because workers do not need to be switching between different tasks. And lastly, workers can be trained in the usage of specialized machinery. Of course, this leads to some disadvantages of specialization. So doing the same task over and over again makes you better at it, but at the same time, it also becomes really boring if you're forced to do the same thing for an overly long period of time. And not to mention, workers become over-dependent on other parts of the production process. So what happens is, if one part stops, it means that nothing else can really progress. And lastly, when it comes to the movement of a worker, workers may become occupationally immobile because they're not able to switch around different tasks because they've been specifically trained for one thing and one thing only. So this means that their ability to hold their job in the long term becomes more and more risky as time goes on. Just to sum up really quickly, the purpose of business activities in a company, it is to combine scarce factors of production in order to create the most efficient way possible to produce goods and services. And this also means that in doing so, we are able to fulfill the needs and wants of people in society. Lastly, and probably one of the most important parts of a business, is that it helps to employ people so that they are paid wages in order to afford the products that will allow them to have a higher standard of living. So there are two main ways that a firm can increase its added value. First of all, you will have to find a way to be able to increase the sales price while keeping costs the same. Secondly, another simple way of doing this would be to lower the cost of whatever they are producing. So one way that they can accomplish this would be by sourcing for cheaper materials, or possibly by outsourcing the labor to another country where factories may be cheaper. We're now looking at 1.2 of the business study syllabus, where we're going to talk about classifications of businesses. Businesses can be classified on what level of economic activity they are at, or which industrial sector they can be found in. So there are three main sectors that we operate in. First of all, we have the primary sector. This sector is most responsible for the production of natural resources, or in other words, raw materials. Next, we have secondary sector, which is more commonly known as the manufacturing sector. So the manufacturing sector, it takes natural materials and resources from the primary sector and then converts them into processed or manufactured goods. Lastly, we have the tertiary sector. So firms in this sector tend to provide services to consumers and other businesses. Examples of which include banking, retail, or even something like teaching. The relative importance of the different economic sectors to a country really depends on quite a few factors. Usually the three sectors will be compared based on the percentage of the country's total workers employed in that sector, or the value of the output of goods and services as a proportion of the total national output. So for example, some countries might focus very much on tourism, and that would fall under the tertiary sector. Or there could be countries that are focused heavily on the extraction of natural resources, such as Australia, that focuses on coal, for example. Developing economies, for example, tend to have a very large primary sector and smaller tertiary and secondary sectors. The reason for this is because they're going through a process called industrialization. Through this, countries are trying to move away from the primary sector in order to offer more added value through the secondary and tertiary sector. So in contrast, developed economies tend to have larger secondary or tertiary sectors. So what are some possible reasons as to why countries may choose to move away from the primary sector? One of which could be that the extraction of natural resources is becoming harder and harder over time because, as we've mentioned before, resources are scarce. As a result, they can become depleted, forcing countries to move towards secondary or tertiary sectors. Next, developed countries tend to lose competitiveness to newly industrialized countries in the manufacturing sector, and thus they tend to move towards the tertiary sector. As countries become more developed, the total wealth and living standard of the country tends to increase. So this means that people are more likely to spend their money on tertiary services rather than primary and secondary products, causing a change in the importance of the different sectors. So as countries become more developed, the total wealth and living standard of the country also changes. So this means that people may be more likely to spend their money on the tertiary sector services rather than primary and secondary sectors, causing a change in the importance of the different sectors. The next thing that we need to cover is the existence of something called the mixed economy, where public and private sector will coexist together. So most countries in the world tend to exist as mixed economies. So a part of the economy is driven by market forces, while another part is actually being controlled by the government. So if we look at public sector businesses, these are businesses which are owned and controlled by the government or the state. This means that the government makes most of the decisions around what they produce and how they produce them, as well as prices which are being charged to customers. So money for these businesses tend to be raised through taxes, and they often provide what we call public goods or merit goods to consumers free of charge. So some examples of this would be police, the fire department, and to some extent, the education sector as well. Now, what do we mean by private sector businesses? So these are controlled by companies and individuals in order to make a profit, and their aim is to maximize the amount of profit that they can gain from society. They are often driven by what we call the market forces of supply and demand, meaning that they will react to incentives. If you are offering a high price for a service which is really desirable to you, companies may then choose to offer those services in order to earn that revenue. Moving on to section 1.3, we have enterprise, business growth, and size. Now we've used this word a few times, entrepreneur. Now what is an entrepreneur? An entrepreneur is an individual who has an idea for a business and takes the financial risk of starting and managing the new business himself. So entrepreneurs usually have an idea for a new business. So this could be something completely new, or they could be aiming to do something better than their competitors. They're prepared to invest a large portion of their savings in order to start the business. And an important part of this would be risk. Now, there's no guarantee that starting a business will lead to any sort of financial success, but entrepreneurs may believe in the vision and mission that they have and choose to start their business while taking on such great risk. As a result, entrepreneurs then have the ability to decide on how they want to manage the business as compared to, let's say, being an employee in an already established business. Now, an important part of being an entrepreneur might mean that you need the right characteristics in order to become one. So some things that you may need to remember would be that they need to be hardworking, they need to take risks because starting a business tends to be a risky decision. Entrepreneurs also tend to be creative and innovative because they need to find new ways to reinvent old things, or they need to be able to come up with completely new ideas that could change the way the society works. They tend to be self-confident as well because they need to be able to convince others of their vision and to work together with them. Of course, being an effective communicator is also an important part of being an entrepreneur because they need to be able to communicate what their vision is to people around them, especially the employees that choose to take on that risk with them. Now, as an entrepreneur, one thing that you might want to have on hand is something that we call a business plan, a detailed written document outlining the purpose and aims of your business, which is often used to persuade people to invest or lend you money. Now, there are a long list of details in a business plan, and not every business plan will be the same. So some things that you might want to take into consideration would be a description of the product that you will be producing, information about how you'll be raising or using the cash in your business, what will the main cost of your business be like, where will your firm be located, and oftentimes investors will also want to know how quickly they will be able to see a return on their investment. Now, how will a business plan benefit an entrepreneur? Well, the information contained in the business plan could help to persuade people to invest in you or for banks to be willing to lend you money. Also, the plan gives you a sense of purpose and direction so that you can also keep track of what you need to accomplish as your business continues. Next, the objectives and financial forecast also provides the business with targets to which they should aim and set their performance to. Lastly, and quite frankly, without a proper business plan, banks are most likely to be unwilling to lend any money to you because they need to ensure that the money that they're investing in you will one day be returned. So most commonly, new businesses which are starting up are called startups. So these are newly founded businesses and are usually starting off quite small. Now, governments tend to be incentivized to support small companies like startups because of a multitude of reasons. First of all, these new companies will help to reduce unemployment, and they also help to increase competition so that businesses will have more reasons to give consumers added value. There will also be increased output in the economy, which will aid economic growth, and entrepreneurs can also be starting businesses in order to enhance social or welfare objectives. Lastly, it is every government's hope that these small startups will one day become large corporations that will continue to provide not only goods and services, but also help to provide employment to the population. Now, it's important to know what are some of the ways that the government can actually support startups. The simplest way would be to provide grants or subsidies or even interest-free loans in order to help to get these businesses off on a good start. Also, newer companies tend to have lower levels of taxation on their profits. Next, governments could also provide free or even subsidized training to workers in order to help them to increase their productivity and skill set. Lastly, governments could set up something called enterprise zones, which are low-cost premises in order for businesses to start up. Next, we need to think about how can we measure business size. Now, one way that we could measure the size of a company would be through the number of people that they employ. A very simple reason for this is because a large company tends to require much more workers than a smaller one. Of course, the limitation behind this could be that large companies tend to be much more productive, and productive companies tend to achieve this by investing very heavily in capital, specialized machinery, and technology in order to ensure that they can hit higher level of outputs despite having a smaller workforce. The next way that we could be measuring the size of a company would be the value of output that they create, or rather the amount of money that they're able to generate as a result of selling their goods or services. Of course, this is not exactly a very good measure when comparing businesses in different industries, and not to mention that the value of output may not be the same as the value of the sales because some goods and services may not be sold. Lastly, a high level of output does not always mean that it's a large business, especially when we're using other methods of measurement. Next, we could also be looking at the amount of capital that they employ, that is, the total value that has been invested into the business. After all, large firms tend to invest much more capital compared to smaller ones. However, a limitation of this could be that firms could reduce output by using labor-intensive methods. In this case, they may actually invest very little in capital, that is machines, and actually rely a lot more on labor costs. If you want to understand how a business works, you also need to understand why companies want to grow their businesses over time. The simplest reason because it could lead to higher levels of profit for the owner. After all, the firm can experience something that we call economies of scale as they increase in size. That is, they reduce the amount of average cost of producing each unit of output. Another reason for this is because the market share of the business could also increase as a result of its growing size. That is, the proportion of the total market relative to the sales that it generates. Next, when you have a larger company, you also tend to have much more power and control and influence over the industry that you are in. Lastly, there is a much higher level of prestige that also helps you to attract better quality workers to want to join your business. A takeover is when one firm buys enough shares in another company in order to gain what we call controlling interest. So these tend to be very hostile, and not to mention very expensive as well. Whereas a merger is something much more peaceful because it is through negotiations, and it is when two companies combine together in order to create a larger firm through the agreement of the current owners. When we're talking about growth, there are two main ways that companies can achieve this. First of all, we have something called internal growth, where growth is paid for using the profits of the existing business. Now, this involves increasing the number of goods and services that a business can produce by developing new products and also by finding new markets for your business. Or you can engage in something that we call external growth, where you take over another company in order to increase your current size, and this can be done either through buying another company or by merging with another one. The difference in that is that a takeover is when one firm is able to buy enough shares in another company in order to gain what we call controlling interest. So what are the different forms of mergers that we can see? So one of the ways that we can actually have a merger is through horizontal integration, which brings together two firms in the same industry who are also in the same sector of business activities. So the benefit of this is, if you are combining with your competitor, this reduces the number of competitors in the industry by one. Not to mention there would be increased opportunities for economies of scale as well, since you're in the same industry. And lastly, you will gain a larger market share as a result of the integration. The next method is what we call forward vertical integration, which brings together two firms in the same industry, but one is currently the customer of the other. So this is when a firm joins with another firm, which is at the stage of production, probably ahead of itself. And the next way that we can do it is what we call backwards integration, where it brings together firms, but one is a supplier to the other. Lastly, we have what is called conglomerate integration, which brings together businesses in completely different industries, and they may or may not be at the same stage of production. The reason for this would be because the business will be able to diversify the activities that it's in, which helps to spread the risk being taken by the business, making it less vulnerable to fall in demand for any of its products. And not to mention, you could also have a transfer of ideas between different sections of the business, which could help to increase your productivity and competitiveness. Now, does it mean that all companies will choose to grow larger? Well, the quick answer for that is really no, because being a bigger company also means that there are bigger problems that could come with it. So larger businesses tend to be more difficult to control because of how complicated it is to coordinate everybody. So this could lead to communication problems between different departments or even different parts of your business. So as you expand, this also means that there is increased financial risk because the cost of running your business will increase as well. And if you're not able to secure more borrowings from the bank, or you're not able to secure more capital from your investors, this could actually lead to insolvency in your company, which could also lead to it closing down. Now, of course, another very big risk of this would be to everyday workers. When companies merge, jobs tend to be created, but also jobs tend to be lost. So as a result, this could lead to a loss of talent in your different companies. And of course, as mergers happen or as takeovers happen, there could be different management styles which are being brought in, some of which may not connect very well with one another, which will also lead to leadership issues. This also leads us to a core part of business studies, where we need to understand that there are different factors and different motivations for each and every style. So, what possible reasons are there for why companies want to remain small? Perhaps it could be due to the owner's objective. So, owners could want to avoid the stress of running a large business, of running a large firm, and they want fewer responsibilities. As a result, they could be satisfied with what they're currently having and be content with currently remaining at the same size. It could also be the type of industry that the company operates in. If you're offering specialized services, it may make more sense for you to remain small because that allows you to build closer and tighter relationships with your customers. Furthermore, there's also the issue of market size. If the market for the product is quite small, firms will tend to remain small. A simple example of this would be neighborhood stores that choose not to operate outside of their geographic area. So it makes very little sense for them to want to increase the size of their business too far because the cost would not be justifiable. So after all this talk about new businesses, it's also important to acknowledge that new businesses can and also very likely are going to fail if they are not run well. So there are reasons for why new companies are at a much greater risk of failure. First of all, it could be very difficult to test the business model that you're trying out, especially if it is a creative and innovative idea that nobody else has done before. Next, it is easy to be over-optimistic in the business plan. After all you're doing is making forecasts, and forecasts are mainly theoretical. This could mean that you are unable to see possible issues in the future or changes in market demand. Next, competitors will not sit on their behinds and wait for you to come in on their territory. Competitors are likely to respond to your business activities as well. When they see something new that is eating away at their business, they'll need to respond, and they could possibly find ways to be more competitive than you. Lastly, in new businesses, it is very common for the entrepreneur behind it to be very new at running a company. As a result, they may lack the necessary management skills to bring the company to higher and higher heights. So for part 1.4, we'll be looking at types of business organizations. First of all, we're going to start off with what we call sole traders. So these are businesses that are owned and controlled by only one person. This person fully owns the business and will receive all the profits that come from it. So the key thing to understand about sole traders would be the advantages and disadvantages that they provide. So first of all, sole traders in terms of advantages are very quick and easy to set up. As a result, sole traders, since they are owned by only one person, they also give the owner full control of everything. As such, they have full decision-making powers. And as a result of this, since they're only a single person, this means that profits do not need to be shared amongst anybody, and they get to keep it all to themselves. Lastly, one of the key advantages of being a sole trader is that you're able to create more personal relationships with your customers. As a result, this could lead to stronger customer loyalty in the long run. Of course, being a sole trader also comes with its own problems. First of all, you will have something called unlimited liability, meaning that should the business fail, you will be liable for all the debts that it incurs. This means that any of your property or any of your assets can actually be seized in order to be used to pay off your debts. In terms of competitiveness, it is also difficult for sole traders to compete with larger firms. Larger firms tend to be much more established, and as a result will have fewer problems when it comes to attracting talents to come and work in their company. This means that you'll be limited to the expertise that you yourself can bring to the business. As a result of having the full responsibility of running the business day to day, it also means that there's a lot of stress on your shoulders, a lot of responsibilities that you need to handle. As a result, it is not uncommon to find that sole traders may fall sick as a result of all the stress that they are experiencing. Another very big problem with being a sole trader is that you may find it very difficult to raise additional capital should you decide to expand your business. This means that as a result, Many sole trader business tend to stay small due to the lack of capital to expand. The next form of business that we'll be looking at is partnerships. Partnerships are usually between 2 to 20 people large, and they are all called partners. These are people who come together in order to run a business together, pooling together finances and also their expertise. You will most often find professions that require certifications such as lawyers or accountants using partnerships in order to form their business. Partnerships are still relatively easy to set up as they have fewer legal requirements than, say, a limited liability business. What you will require is something called a deed of partnership. Compared to sole traders, partnerships will find it much easier to raise finance because you are able to bring in additional partners into your business should you require to expand it. Next, unlike a sole trader, a partnership also allows you to depend on your fellow partners in order to run the business on a day-to-day basis. The strength of the partnership also depends on the type of people that you bring in. Being able to bring in people of different expertise means that you'll be able to fill in gaps of knowledge which your business may lack. So one of the key advantages of a partnership as compared to being a sole trader is that you're still able to bring in different forms of knowledge and expertise in with your partners. If you're able to choose the right people, this could help to plug in some of the knowledge gaps that you may have as a sole trader, meaning that you'll be able to run your business much more efficiently and smoothly. Of course, there are still a few disadvantages with being a partnership. First of all, general partnerships still tend to be unlimited in terms of liability, although this time you will be sharing that liability with your other partners. Another very big problem compared to being a sole trader is that the profit that is generated by your partnership has to be shared across everybody. Next, different countries will have different requirements in terms of how many partners may be allowed to join your partnership. However, of course, this depends on individual countries. Lastly, as with any partnership, the biggest issue comes in terms of disagreements. As a sole trader, you're able to decide the trajectory and direction of your company. However, within partnerships, typically agreements will need to be met in order to move the partnership within a certain direction. In fact, within a partnership, you may be required to make certain decisions that you disagree with. However, since it is most likely going to be decided based on majority, you will most likely have to go with those decisions even if you strongly disagree with them. Next, we'll be looking at limited companies. We will first start with private limited companies. These are companies that are owned by a small number of shareholders who may be family or friends. The director will most likely be the most important or majority shareholder. This is what we call an incorporated business, and typically the director within the company is the one that holds the majority share. There will be 3 documents which will be required to form this private limited company: the Article of Association, the Memorandum of Association, and the Certificate of Incorporation. Now, it is worth mentioning that private limited companies are one of the most common forms of business ownership as a result of all the advantages that it brings. Chiefly, that you are able to sell shares to family or friends in order to raise additional capital. This makes it much easier to raise funds to expand your business should the need arise. And of course, not ignoring the name, being a limited liability company means that you will not be able to lose anything beyond your initial investment in a company. So this means that even in the off chance that your company is being sued for, let's say, $1 million, as long as you have only invested 100, the maximum that you will be able to lose is $100. Your personal assets will be protected. Furthermore, in terms of control of the company, this comes in the form of shares. Typically, as long as you hold a majority number of shares, approximately 51%, this means that you're able to control the business as you like. Of course, you have to take note that you must not sell too many shares which may liquidate your controlling interest. Another key advantage that we have is that the business and individuals that own it are seen to be separate legal entities. As a result, this means that even if the business was being negligent, the individual itself cannot be held responsible. Finally, something to take into account when it comes to business ownership is the need to pass it on to future generations or to transfer ownership. In a private limited company, it is much easier to transfer ownership through the transference of shares. This will mean that the ownership of the company will move to whoever is holding onto the shares of the company. In the case of being a private limited company, there are usually more legal requirements when it comes to holding of financial records. This means that every year, companies will need to prepare something called an annual report, which will then be submitted to legal authorities. The key difference that separates the private limited company to the next form of ownership that we'll be discussing is that the shares cannot be sold to the public. Typically, the shares in a private limited company can only be sold to people that you immediately know, unlike the next company that we'll be discussing. So the next form of business we'll be looking at is called a public limited company. So the key difference here is that in addition to enjoying most of the benefits that have been discussed for private limited companies, they are also allowed to sell their shares on something called the stock exchange. Some of the biggest companies in the world are called public limited companies because you are able to buy their shares. So some of the biggest companies in the world are public limited companies. Some of the names that come to mind would be Alphabet, which owns Google, Meta, which owns Facebook, and Tesla. So the extension of limited liability also extends to the people who hold their shares. That is to say, if I'm holding a share of a company right now and that company were to go bankrupt, my personal assets would not be liable to be taken by creditors. And interestingly enough, unlike a private limited company, there is no real limit on the number of shareholders that you can have in a public limited company. The only thing that would probably limit you would be the number of shares that you have available for purchase. When it comes to raising of funds in order to expand your business, there's really nothing that tops being a public limited company. This is because when you sell shares to the public, you're able to advertise the sale of it through a prospectus. In fact, once a company is listed, the value of the shares can also typically go up. This means that the shares that you sell can also lead to long-term gains, making it much more easy for you to raise capital. And of course, looking at trade-offs. Now, in order to have a public limited company, it is much more tedious in order to file the necessary forms and do all the paperwork in order to protect the legal basis of your company. This means that it is much more expensive and time-consuming in order to prepare those documents. There are much more regulations and controls over the actions of a public limited company. This also may include regular detailed publications of your accounts, which are required every single year. And these accounts are also available to the public, which means that your competitors are also able to get their hands on it. That is not to say that selling of shares to the public can happen for free, as if you can create money out of thin air. The prospectus will also need to be prepared, which means that there will be additional costs for the company. Next, this also means that because anybody can purchase your shares, this means that you're also much more liable for something that we call a hostile takeover. Unlike in a private limited company, where the sale of shares needs to be agreed upon by the different shareholders, in a public limited company, anybody can purchase your shares, including companies that may be trying to take over your business. Lastly, one of the key legal requirements of having a public limited company is holding something called the annual general meeting. So this annual general meeting is a meeting of the different shareholders where they're able to ask questions and demand answers from the CEO. These events tend to be very time consuming to carry out, and not to mention they are expensive as well. The next form of business that we're going to be looking at is called a franchise. So there are many major businesses out there that come to mind when we talk about franchises, the most famous one being McDonald's. So a franchise is a system where entrepreneurs buy the right to use the name, logo, and product of an existing business. Typically, we will do this because it is already something that is established and is much less risky than starting off your own business. The person that buys the franchise rights is called the franchisee, and the person who sells the franchise rights is called the franchisor. In order to understand the different benefits, we will probably need to take the perspective of both the person buying and selling the franchise rights. So to the franchisor, the key thing is that when you license a brand name, it means that you are buying something that is already established and is much more likely to be recognized by the public, making it easier for you to sell their products. As a result of that, the chance of failure is much lower. Not to mention, when it comes to advertising, typically this will be paid by the franchise owner. When it comes to the additional costs of running the business, such as advertising costs or searching of suppliers, typically these all fall under the requirements of the franchisor. So as the franchisee, all you need to do is ensure that you're able to run your business in a profitable manner. Typically, this also means that training for staff and management will be provided by the franchisor. And since that you're under the umbrella of the franchise, it also means that businesses are more likely to be able to borrow money from the bank if necessary. Now, of course, with all these advantages come some small trade-offs. First of all, unlike running your own business, when you license a franchise from somebody, you do not usually have the rights to make most of the decisions. The biggest top-down decisions will be coming from the headquarters that you licensed it from. As a result, some of the business decisions that you make may not be quite so suited to local areas because you're unable to adapt them according to your different needs. Not to mention, in order to have the franchise from the franchisor, you need to pay something called a franchise fee. And not to mention, it would only make sense that a percentage of your profits would actually be handed over to the person who gave you the franchise. So some of the advantages of being a franchisor means that you're able to gain money from selling of your licenses. The expansion of the business is also much faster because others are coming in and paying for the right to run your business under your own. As a franchisor, you're able to have full control over the people who license the business from you. As a result, since they will have to buy the supplies from you, this gives you a lot of control over the different people who franchise it. Ideally speaking, as a franchisor, what you want to do is to gain the franchise fees and also strategically manage the business, meaning that the day-to-day operations will be in the hands of the franchisee. This then allows you to make more strategic decisions over how you're going to expand your business rather than focusing on operations. Now, one of the biggest disadvantages of being a franchisor is that the actions of one franchisee could affect your entire brand. This means that a lot more effort must be put into place in order to ensure that the person buying the franchise is someone who is appropriate and will act in your best interest. Lastly, the bulk of the profits will actually belong to the person who franchises it from you and will not go directly to you. Typically, the franchisor only takes a small percentage of what the franchisor earns. The next form of business that we can look at is something called a joint venture. It is when two or more different businesses agree to combine their efforts together in order to pursue something different. The advantage, of course, is that the cost and the risk of such a venture will be spread out across the two businesses. Not to mention, the two different businesses are most likely coming together because they have a sort of expertise that the other side lacks, and this helps you to plug up knowledge gaps once again. Of course, the disadvantage is that the profit that you gain is not going to be fully yours and will most likely be distributed between the two. Next, disagreements could happen between joint ventures, which may make it legally complex to separate out from the person that you're having a joint venture with. Any sort of actions that are taken which may damage the reputation of either company will also affect the other indirectly. Now, we've talked extensively about private sector businesses, that is, businesses that are in the market in order to earn profits. Now, let us look at the public sector. The public sector is made up of public corporations, which may be wholly owned by the state or central government. This means that they are nationalized businesses, and although they are run by the government, may have their own board of directors. The board of directors will then help the governments to run the business according to the government's objectives. Typically, businesses in the public sector will be financed by taxation, and they will have social objectives, which means that they are trying to maximize the welfare of the people in the country. This leads to one of the biggest problems when it comes to running a public corporation. The goods and services that you provide are most likely going to be very important. However, you are not able to charge high prices for them because they are provided for the welfare of the people that you serve. Now, one of the greatest things about being a public corporation is that typically, because you are being run by the government, you will have an essential monopoly on what is being provided. This also means that governments have it in their best interest to not allow the company to go bankrupt and may choose to bail you out if you run into issues. And of course, one of the most amazing things about being a public corporation is that you are not primarily focused on generating high levels of profit, but rather you will be judged based on how smoothly and how consistently you're able to provide such services to the population. One of the key disadvantages of being a public corporation is that since profit maximization is not your key objective, this may lead to inefficiencies in how you run the business. Since you're also more dependent on being provided subsidies in order to run the public corporation, this also adds on to additional layers of inefficiencies that may happen within the corporation. So for 1.5, we're going to be looking at business objectives and stakeholder objectives. Now, there are quite a few reasons that you have to know about why businesses require objectives. First of all, it gives workers and managers a clear target to work towards and provides motivation for them. Next, decisions will also be dependent on what sort of objectives we're trying to work towards, so this also guides us along in how we run our business. Clear and measurable objectives also help to unite the business because we all know that we're working towards the same thing. And lastly, it helps to also give a clear measure of success to managers. You may have often heard the acronym SMART when it comes to setting goals, and businesses are really not any different. Business objectives need to be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and also time-specific. Now, there are four main business objectives that businesses may have. First of all, when it comes to the survival of the company, this means that a firm may not necessarily strive towards making profits, but instead will simply aim to remain in the business. This is particularly important for newfound businesses which are trying to find their footing within the first few years of operation. However, it could also be an aim for larger businesses in times of economic downturn, such as a recession. The next thing that you'll hear very often is that businesses will aim to grow. So the growth objective of a business looks at how companies are going to increase the scale of their production or grow. This means that they will be measured by the value of their sales or output. So one of the key reasons that you want to do this is to ensure that jobs in your company are a lot more secure. This also means that you are able to diversify or spread the risk of running your business. And lastly, the most important thing of being able to grow your business is that you're able to achieve economies of scale and cost advantages. The larger a company is able to grow, the better it is able to control their costs and thereby increase profits as well. Speaking of profits, profitability is the next business objective that we'll be discussing. Businesses tend to have investors, and investors are looking to make a return on their investment. So profitability is what allows a company to repay them. Furthermore, profitability is also what allows you to fuel the growth of your business. This is much cheaper than, say, borrowing money from a bank and needing to pay interest. Not to mention, profitability is often one of the most important signs of success in a company. Now, there are quite a few reasons why companies may choose to increase their market share. First of all, it is really good publicity for you if you are the largest within your industry. Not to mention, this also gives you additional influence over your suppliers, which may help you in negotiating for better costs, which may help you to better negotiate for better prices when you're buying from your suppliers. Lastly, it also helps you to gain better influence over your consumers, which will allow you to set higher prices for your products or services. So the next thing that we're going to be discussing is social enterprises. These are businesses that may operate in a for-profit environment, but profit maximization is typically not their most important objective. They often seek to do three things. Social, that is to provide jobs and support for disadvantaged groups. The next thing is that they could be focusing on environmental concerns, where they're trying to protect the environment or to prevent further damage to it. Lastly, they could have financial objectives, where they're trying to reinvest any profits that they're able to gain back into the social enterprise in order to better serve the people that they're targeting. So when we talk about social enterprises, it's also important to understand this term called corporate social responsibility. That is where businesses try to take more responsibility for the impact of their decisions on the population or on the communities that they are targeting. Now, corporate social responsibility has become a bit of a buzzword in the past few decades, and that is because of the increased pressure based on the media reporting on activities of businesses, based on trade unions whom have more power in terms of how their employees are being treated. It could also be due to the media reporting a lot more on the activities of businesses, pressure coming from individual groups, and also governments taking a more active stand in ensuring that businesses operate in a more ethical manner. The next important term that we need to understand is what exactly is a stakeholder. An easy way to understand this would be that stakeholders would be anyone that is interested in the business activity of a company or who would be affected by the business activity of a company. Internal stakeholders could include the owner of the company, whom is concerned about the profitability of his company and whether or not it is able to generate a return in the long run. Also, the workers that are employed by the company will count as a very large group of stakeholders, since they are more concerned about job security and possibly whether or not their salary is able to keep up with their cost of living. Of course, the next group that we have would be the managers. Managers are most concerned about the stability and security of the business, since this could affect their long-term career progression. Now, the number of external stakeholders could be much more complicated than what we have just seen for internal stakeholders. First of all, we obviously have the customer, people who buy goods and services from the company. Customers are most likely going to be concerned about the safety and reliability of the product that they are consuming. They will be concerned about whether or not it is value for money and whether or not the products are of good quality. Customers may also be concerned about the serviceability and how well they're able to maintain the goods that they purchase from the company. Next up, we have the government, and the government tends to be concerned about the economic performance of the company, since that will affect jobs and thereby standard of living of the population. Governments will also need to balance this out because they need to put into place laws that will protect workers in order to ensure that they have a safe working environment. Governments often want businesses to succeed because this will help to reduce unemployment within the country, which will make everybody better off. Next, we have society as a whole. Society is most going to be concerned about the activities of a business because the actions that they take could indirectly affect their lives. One of the biggest groups of stakeholders that you will be able to see is society as a whole. Businesses operate within communities, within neighborhoods, within countries, which means that their business activities could also affect everyday people, those not directly involved with the production of the goods or may not even be involved in the consumption of those goods.